The mud never dried in the sepulchre approaches. 8 centuries of holy war had turned the earth into a soup of blood and blessed rust, where every footstep squelched with the weight of martyred bone. Private Matthias Keller pressed his face against the firing step, peering through the scope of his bolt-action rifle at the wasteland that stretched between the new syncretic Orthodox trenches and the heretic legion positions 300 yards distant. The fog rolled in from the east, thick as communion wine and twice as dark. It carried with it the scent of incense burned over corpses, the metallic tang of blessed ammunition, and something else. Something that made his teeth ache in their sockets. Bell towers rose from no man's land like the ribs of some vast beast. Once they had called the faithful to prayer in villages that no longer existed, their names erased by 8 centuries of grinding warfare. Now they stood broken, their bells silent, their stones blackened by the smoke of 1,000 bombardments. Matthias counted 17 of them in his sector alone, their shadows stretching across the crater-pocked earth like fingers reaching for the living. The tower closest to his position leaned at an impossible angle, its foundation carved away by shell fire until it seemed to balance on nothing but habit and spite. Its bell chamber gaped open like a wound, revealing the bronze throat within. No clapper hung there. The artillery had seen to that months ago, when the 47th Trench pilgrims had tried to advance during the Feast of Sorrows. The bells had rung then, their notes sharp enough to shatter bone, and the pilgrims had died screaming with their ears, bleeding rivers of sacred oil. Matthias had been there. He remembered the sound. The fog thickened, and the towers vanished behind its gray curtain. Somewhere in the distance, a machine gun chattered its metal prayer, answered by the wet slap of bullets finding flesh. The war continued, as it always did, as it always would. The Hell Gate had opened in Jerusalem 8 centuries ago, and the faithful had been dying for it ever since. Sergeant Vogel crawled along the trench bottom, his boots splashing through the ankle-deep mixture of rainwater and sanctified blood that pooled in every corner of their position. His uniform bore the triple cross of the new syncretic Orthodox, the silver threads tarnished black by the perpetual dampness. When he reached Matthias, he settled into a crouch, his breathing labored. "Orders from the lieutenant," Vogel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No movement after dark. The heretics are planning something." Matthias nodded, though he kept his eye pressed to the scope. The fog was doing strange things to the light, making shadows where there should be none, creating movement where the towers stood motionless. His finger rested on the trigger, not quite touching, ready to squeeze at the first sign of an enemy advance. "What kind of something?" he asked. Vogel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had seen too much. The kind that makes the bells ring without clappers. The fog pressed closer, and the temperature dropped. Matthias felt it in his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of empty churches, of prayers spoken to deaf saints, of faith bleeding out into black soil. His breath misted in the air, and frost began to form on the metal parts of his rifle. Behind them, deeper in the trench system, someone was praying. The words came in the old tongue, the language of martyrs and blessed war, but they sounded wrong, hollow, as if the speaker's mouth was full of stones. Vogel's hand found his sidearm, a blessed pistol that had been in his family for 3 generations. The grip was worn smooth by the palms of the faithful, and the barrel was inscribed with verses from the war psalms. He did not draw it, but his fingers traced the familiar contours of the weapon. "The towers," he said, so quietly that Matthias almost missed it. "They're not where they were this morning." Matthias pulled away from his scope and looked at the sergeant. Vogel's face was gray in the dim light, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen the shape of his own death. "What do you mean?" "Count them," Vogel said. "Count the towers you can see." Matthias returned to his scope, sweeping it across the fog-shrouded wasteland. The mist parted and reformed, revealing glimpses of the battlefield beyond. Craters filled with black water. Tangles of blessed wire, their barbs sharp enough to cut both flesh and spirit. The twisted remains of vehicles, their metal blessed and cursed in equal measure. And the towers. Matthias began counting, moving his scope methodically from left to right. 1, 2, 3. The fourth was barely visible through the fog, its outline ghostly and indistinct. 5, 6, 7. He stopped, blinked, counted again. 7 towers. There should have been 17. "They're closer," Vogel said, reading the expression on Matthias's face. "The ones we can see, they're closer than they were." Matthias wanted to argue, to insist that the fog was playing tricks, that the stress of constant warfare was making them see things that weren't there. But the cold was getting worse, and the praying behind them had stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than any he had ever heard, as if the very air was holding its breath. The first bell began to toll. The sound came from the tower closest to their position, the one that leaned at its impossible angle. It was a deep, resonant note that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself, shaking loose stones from the trench walls and causing the blessed water at their feet to ripple in perfect circles. But there was no clapper in that bell, no mechanism to produce the sound. Matthias pressed his hands to his ears, but the note penetrated flesh and bone, settling into his skull like a parasite. His teeth began to ache, and he tasted blood on his tongue. Beside him, Vogel was on his knees, his face contorted in pain. The sound changed, deepened, became something that was not quite music and not quite screaming. Other towers began to join the chorus, their voices adding harmonies that made the metal of their weapons sing in sympathy. The fog swirled faster, and shadows moved within it, shapes that might have been men or might have been something else entirely. Through his scope, Matthias saw the impossible. The leaning tower was moving, not falling as it should have, but lifting itself upright. Its foundation, carved away by shell fire, was reforming, but not with stone. Twisted metal pushed up from the earth like the legs of some enormous spider, lifting the tower's bulk into the air. The bell within its chamber swung without a clapper, its bronze throat open like a mouth. The tower took a step toward their trench. The ground shook with its footfall, and the walls of their position began to crack. Chunks of sanctified earth fell into the water at their feet, dissolving like sugar in the blessed mixture. The praying behind them resumed, but now it was screaming, the voices of their fellow soldiers raised in terror and desperate faith. Matthias fired. The bullet struck the tower's bell chamber, sending up a shower of sparks, but the structure continued its advance. Its metal legs moved with a hideous grace, each step bringing it closer to their position. The bell tolled again, and this time the sound was joined by others, a symphony of bronze voices that made the air itself vibrate. Vogel struggled to his feet, his sidearm in his hand. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession, each one blessed and consecrated, but the bullets seemed to pass through the tower without effect. The structure was 20 yards away now, its shadow falling across their trench like a promise of death. "Fall back," Vogel shouted, but his voice was lost in the tolling of the bells. The sound was everywhere now, coming from all directions, as if the very earth was singing. "Fall back to the secondary positions." Matthias grabbed his rifle and followed the sergeant, splashing through the ankle-deep water as fast as his legs could carry him. Behind them, the tower's foot came down on their abandoned position, crushing the firing step and sending a fountain of mud and sanctified blood into the air. The bells tolled louder, and the fog seemed to press in around them, thick as smoke and twice as choking. They reached the communication trench and turned left, running toward the secondary positions. Other soldiers were fleeing alongside them, their faces pale with terror, their weapons clutched in hands that shook with more than cold. The bells followed them, their notes bending and warping as they reflected off the trench walls, creating echoes that seemed to come from below as well as above. Private Hoffman stumbled and fell, his hands pressed to his ears. Blood was streaming from his nose, and his eyes had rolled back in his head. Matthias grabbed him under the arms and hauled him to his feet, but the young soldier's legs wouldn't support him. The bells were doing something to him, something that went beyond simple sound. "Leave him," Vogel shouted, but Matthias couldn't. Not yet, not while the boy still breathed. He slung his rifle across his back and lifted Hoffman in a fireman's carry, staggering under the weight as he continued down the trench. The bells were getting closer, their notes so deep now that they seemed to be coming from inside his own chest. His heart struggled to beat against the rhythm they imposed, and his lungs fought for air that tasted of bronze and blessed rust. They reached the secondary positions, where Lieutenant Brennan was trying to organize a defense. The officer's face was grim, his usually immaculate uniform stained with mud and something darker. He was shouting orders, but his voice was barely audible over the tolling of the bells. "Machine, gun positions," he was saying. "Concentrated fire on the towers. They can be stopped." But even as he spoke, Matthias could see the doubt in his eyes. The towers were not natural things, not structures that could be destroyed by conventional means. They were something else, something that had been birthed from the same hellgate that had opened in Jerusalem 8 centuries ago. They were manifestations of the war itself, given form and purpose by the collective faith and desperation of the faithful. Matthias set Hoffman down behind a sandbag position and checked his pulse. The boy was still alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow, and his skin was cold to the touch. The bells had done something to him, something that went beyond physical damage. They had touched his spirit, his very essence, and left it trembling on the edge of dissolution. The first tower appeared at the edge of their position, its massive form silhouetted against the fog. It moved with the same hideous grace, its metal legs picking their way carefully between the obstacles and defensive positions. The bell in its chamber swung slowly, almost hypnotically, and the sound it produced was like the voice of God filtered through the throat of a dying angel. The machine gunners opened fire, their blessed ammunition creating streams of tracer fire that lit up the fog like lightning. The bullets struck the tower's stone body, chipping away small fragments, but the structure continued its advance. Its bell tolled once, twice, 3 times, and with each note, the machine guns jammed, their mechanisms seized by sound, made manifest. Other towers were emerging from the fog now, their forms ghostly and indistinct, but unmistakably real. They moved in a rough line, their bells tolling in harmony, creating a wall of sound that pushed against the defenders like a physical force. Men fell to their knees, their hands pressed to their ears, blood streaming from their noses and mouths. Matthias raised his rifle and fired, working the bolt and firing again, each shot carefully aimed at the bell chamber of the nearest tower. The bullets struck true, sending up showers of sparks, but the structure was unaffected. The bell continued to toll, its note pure and terrible, and the tower continued its advance. Behind him, someone was praying again. The words were in the old tongue, the language of martyrs and blessed war, but they sounded different now, urgent, desperate, as if the speaker was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. The tower was 10 yards away now, its shadow falling across their position like a shroud. Its bell chamber was open, revealing the bronze throat within, and Matthias could see something moving in the darkness there, something that might have been a clapper, but was not. Something that pulsed with its own light, like a heart made of blessed metal. The bell tolled once more, and the sound was so close, so overwhelming, that Matthias felt his consciousness begin to fray at the edges. His vision blurred, and he tasted blood on his tongue. The rifle in his hands felt impossibly heavy, and his finger could no longer find the trigger. The tower's foot came down on the sandbags, crushing them like paper. The structure leaned forward, its bell chamber opening wider, and the light within grew brighter. The sound it produced was no longer a bell's tolling, but something else, something that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the soul. Matthias tried to scream, but no sound came. The world around him was dissolving, the trenches and the fog, and the other soldiers fading like smoke. Only the tower remained, its bronze throat open, its light pulsing with the rhythm of his failing heart. And then, silence. The bells stopped tolling all at once, their voices cut off as if by a knife. The fog began to clear, revealing the battlefield in stark detail. The towers stood motionless, their metal legs planted firmly in the earth, their bell chambers dark and empty. The machine guns had resumed their chatter, and the voices of the defenders could be heard again, raised in confused shouts and desperate prayers. Matthias blinked, and the world snapped back into focus. He was lying on his back behind the sandbags, his rifle beside him, Hoffman unconscious at his side. The tower that had been advancing on their position was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. In its place was only empty air and the distant sound of artillery. Vogel was kneeling beside him, his face pale with concern. "Matthias," he was saying. "Matthias, can you hear me?" Matthias tried to speak, but his throat was raw, as if he had been screaming for hours. He managed a nod, and Vogel's expression relaxed slightly. "The towers," Matthias croaked. "Where did they go?" Vogel looked out over the battlefield, his eyes scanning the fog-shrouded wasteland. The towers were still there, 17 of them in their sector, standing motionless in the exact positions they had always occupied. But something was different about them now, something that made Matthias's skin crawl. "They never moved," Vogel said quietly. "According to the lieutenant, they never moved at all." Matthias struggled to sit up, his head spinning. But we saw them. We heard the bells. No, Vogel said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. We heard nothing. The bells have been silent for months, ever since the artillery destroyed the clappers. Matthias looked at the towers again, studying their broken silhouettes through his scope. They were exactly where they had always been, their bell chambers dark and empty, their foundations firmly planted in the earth. But he could swear he saw something moving in the shadows of their broken stones, something that pulsed with its own light. The fog began to thicken again, and the temperature dropped. Matthias felt the cold in his bones, and his teeth began to ache. Somewhere in the distance, a machine gun chattered its metal prayer, and the war continued, as it always did, as it always would. But now he knew that the towers were watching, waiting, and when the fog rolled in again, they would walk. The night brought no rest. Matthias lay in his dugout, listening to the sounds of the war around him. Artillery rumbled in the distance, its thunder mixing with the whisper of blessed ammunition passing overhead. Machine guns chattered their metal prayers, and men died screaming in languages both sacred and profane. But underneath it all, he could hear something else. A sound so low it was felt rather than heard, a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was the sound of massive weights shifting, of stone grinding against stone, of metal scraping against metal. The towers were moving again, he was certain of it, but when he pressed his eye to the periscope, they stood exactly where they had always stood. Hoffman had not awakened. The boy lay in the medical station, his breathing shallow, his skin cold to the touch. The medic, a grizzled veteran named Koch, had examined him thoroughly, but found no obvious injuries. "It's shock," he had said, but his eyes had held doubt. "Shell, shock, he'll come around." But Matthias had seen the look on Hoffman's face when the bells had tolled. It was not the expression of a man in shock. It was the expression of a man who had seen something that had fundamentally altered his understanding of the world, something that had reached into his soul and left it permanently scarred. The vibration grew stronger, and the walls of the dugout began to shake. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the blessed water in his canteen began to ripple. Matthias grabbed his rifle and crawled out into the trench, where other soldiers were stirring uneasily in their positions. The fog was rolling in again, thick and dark, carrying with it the scent of incense and blessed rust. But there was something else in the air now, something that made his skin crawl and his teeth ache. It was the smell of bronze, heated to near melting, of metal under enormous stress, of sound made manifest. Vogel appeared beside him, his face grim. "The lieutenant wants to see you," he said, "in the command bunker." Matthias followed the sergeant through the communication trenches, splashing through ankle-deep water that tasted of sanctified blood. The command bunker was a reinforced position dug deep into the earth, its walls lined with sandbags and blessed steel. Lieutenant Brennan was waiting for them, his usually immaculate uniform stained with mud and something darker. "Keller," the officer said without preamble, "tell me what you saw today." Matthias glanced at Vogel, who nodded encouragingly. "The towers, sir. They moved. They walked on legs made of metal, and their bells tolled without clappers." Brennan's expression did not change. And what did these bells sound like? "Like the voice of God," Matthias said, the words coming unbidden, but filtered through the throat of something dying. The lieutenant was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I've received similar reports from 3 other sectors. The towers are moving, but only when the fog is thick, only when visibility is poor, and only certain men can see them. Certain men, sir? Men who have been in the trenches too long, Brennan said. Men whose faith has been tested beyond its breaking point. Men who have seen too much of what this war can do. Matthias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. You're saying we're losing our minds. I'm saying you're seeing things that others cannot, Brennan replied. Whether those things are real or not is a question I'm not qualified to answer. The vibration grew stronger, and the walls of the bunker began to shake. The blessed water in the lieutenant's canteen began to ripple, and dust fell from the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, a sound began to build, so low it was felt rather than heard. It was the sound of massive weights shifting, of stone grinding against stone, of metal scraping against metal. The fog, Vogel said, his voice tight with tension. It's getting thicker. Brennan nodded grimly. All units to stand. 2. Full alert. If the towers are moving, we need to be ready. They made their way back to the firing positions, where the other soldiers were already at their posts. The fog was indeed getting thicker, rolling in from no man's land, like a living thing. It pressed against the trench walls, seeking entry, and where it touched the blessed steel, sparks flew. Matthias took his position at the periscope, scanning the fog-shrouded wasteland beyond. The towers were still there, 17 of them in their sector, standing motionless in the exact positions they had always occupied. But something was different about them now. Their shadows seemed to move independently of their bodies, stretching and contracting like living things. The first bell began to toll. The sound came from the tower closest to their position, the one that leaned at its impossible angle. It was a deep, resonant note that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself, shaking loose stones from the trench walls and causing the blessed water at their feet to ripple in perfect circles. But there was still no clapper in that bell, no mechanism to produce the sound. Matthias pressed his hands to his ears, but the note penetrated flesh and bone, settling into his skull like a parasite. His teeth began to ache, and he tasted blood on his tongue. Around him, the other soldiers were reacting similarly, their faces contorted in pain. Through the periscope, he watched the impossible. The leaning tower was moving, not falling as it should have, but lifting itself upright. Its foundation, carved away by shell fire, was reforming, but not with stone. Twisted metal pushed up from the earth like the legs of some enormous spider, lifting the tower's bulk into the air. The bell within its chamber swung without a clapper, its bronze throat open like a mouth. The tower took a step toward their trench. But this time, Matthias was ready. He had spent the day thinking about what he had seen, trying to understand the nature of the towers and their purpose. They were not natural things, not structures that could be destroyed by conventional means. They were something else, something that existed in the spaces between reality and faith, between the seen and the unseen. He pulled out his sidearm, a blessed pistol that had been his father's, and his father's before him. The grip was worn smooth by the palms of the faithful, and the barrel was inscribed with verses from the war psalms. But instead of loading it with conventional ammunition, he had prepared something else. Bullets made from the metal of bell clappers, blessed by the chaplain and inscribed with the names of the martyred. The tower was closer now, its metal legs picking their way carefully between the obstacles and defensive positions. The bell in its chamber swung slowly, almost hypnotically, and the sound it produced was like the voice of God filtered through the throat of a dying angel. Matthias aimed carefully, not at the tower's stone body, but at the bell within its chamber. The bullet struck true, and for a moment, the tolling stopped. The tower wavered, its massive form becoming translucent, and Matthias thought he had succeeded. But then the bell began to toll again, louder than before, and the tower solidified once more. The bullet had passed through the bronze throat without effect, and the structure continued its advance. Its shadow fell across their position like a shroud, and the light within its bell chamber grew brighter. Other towers were emerging from the fog now, their forms ghostly and indistinct, but unmistakably real. They moved in a rough line, their bells tolling in harmony, creating a wall of sound that pushed against the defenders like a physical force. Men fell to their knees, their hands pressed to their ears, blood streaming from their noses and mouths. Matthias tried to retreat, but his legs would not obey. The sound was overwhelming, penetrating every cell of his body, and he felt his consciousness begin to fray at the edges. His vision blurred, and he tasted blood on his tongue. The world around him was dissolving, the trenches and the fog and the other soldiers fading like smoke. Only the towers remained, their bronze throats open, their light pulsing with the rhythm of his failing heart. And in that light, he saw something that made his sanity crack like glass. The bells were not empty. They contained something that pulsed with its own life. It was not a clapper, not a mechanism designed to produce sound. It was something else, something that had once been human but was no longer. Something that had been transformed by the war, by the constant exposure to blessed and cursed energies, into something that existed solely to produce the sound that drove men mad. The towers were not just moving, they were hunting, and they were using the bells to call their prey. Matthias screamed, but no sound came. The world around him was dissolving, and he felt himself being pulled into the bronze throat of the nearest tower. The light within was warm and welcoming, and he could hear voices calling to him, voices that he recognized. His father's voice, his mother's voice, the voices of friends who had died in the war. They were calling him home. But just as he was about to surrender to the light, something grabbed his arm. It was Vogel, his face contorted with effort, his voice barely audible over the tolling of the bells. "Fight it," he was shouting. "Fight the sound. It's not real." Matthias blinked, and the world snapped back into focus. He was standing in the trench, his rifle in his hands, the towers visible through the fog but motionless. The bells were silent, their bronze throats dark and empty. The machine guns had resumed their chatter, and the voices of the defenders could be heard again, raised in confused shouts and desperate prayers. "The towers," Matthias gasped. "They were moving. They were calling to me." Vogel's expression was grim. "They were, but they're not anymore. The fog is clearing." Matthias looked out over the battlefield, where the mist was indeed beginning to dissipate. The towers stood exactly where they had always stood, their bell chambers dark and empty, their foundations firmly planted in the earth. But he could swear he saw something moving in the shadows of their broken stones, something that pulsed with its own light. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that they would walk again. When the fog rolled in, when the visibility was poor, when the faithful had been tested beyond their breaking point, the towers would walk, and they would call to those who had seen too much, who had been in the trenches too long, who had lost their way in the endless war. They would call them home. The third night brought dreams that were not dreams. Matthias found himself standing in a vast cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadows, its walls lined with bells of every size and shape. The floor beneath his feet was made of polished brass, and it reflected the light of countless candles that burned without wicks, their flames dancing in the still air. He was not alone. Other soldiers stood beside him, men from his unit and men he had never seen before. They were all dressed in the uniforms of the faithful, but their faces were pale and their eyes were hollow. They stood in perfect silence, their hands at their sides, their gazes fixed on the altar at the far end of the cathedral. The altar was made of black stone, and it was covered with bells. Not the great bronze bells of the towers, but smaller ones, silver and gold and copper, each one inscribed with the name of a fallen soldier. They hung from chains that disappeared into the shadows above, and they swayed gently in the candlelight. A figure stood behind the altar, robed in the vestments of a high priest. Its face was hidden by a hood, but Matthias could see its hands, pale and skeletal, as they moved among the bells. It was conducting a service, a mass for the dead, and the bells were its congregation. The figure raised its hands, and the bells began to toll. Not the harsh, discordant sound of the towers, but a gentle, melodious chiming that seemed to come from heaven itself. The sound was beautiful, peaceful, and Matthias felt his fears and doubts melting away. This was what he had been searching for, what he had been fighting for all these years. This was peace. But then the chiming changed, became deeper, more resonant. The smaller bells fell silent, and the great bronze bells of the towers began to toll. The sound was overwhelming, penetrating every cell of his body, and he felt his consciousness begin to fray at the edges. He tried to run, but his legs would not obey. The other soldiers were moving now, walking toward the altar with slow, measured steps. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes vacant, and they moved in perfect unison, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Matthias fought against the compulsion, but it was too strong. His feet began to move, carrying him toward the altar against his will. The bells tolled louder, and the figure behind the altar raised its head, revealing a face that was not human. It was made of bronze, polished to a mirror shine, and its eyes were empty sockets that burned with inner fire. The figure spoke, and its voice was the sound of bells tolling, of metal grinding against metal, of stone cracking under enormous pressure. "Come," it said. "Come and join the eternal choir. Come and sing the song that will end the war." Matthias opened his mouth to scream, but only the sound of bells came out. His voice had been taken, replaced by the bronze throat of the towers. He was becoming one of them, one of the mechanisms that produced the sound that drove men mad. He woke with a start, his heart pounding, his body drenched in sweat. The dugout was dark and silent, and the war continued outside, its sounds muffled by the earth and sandbags. But the memory of the dream lingered, and he could still hear the echoes of the bells in his mind. Vogel was sitting beside him, his face grim. "The same dream?" he asked. Matthias nodded, unable to speak. He had told the sergeant about the cathedral, about the figure behind the altar, about the bells that called to the faithful. Vogel had listened without comment, but his expression had grown more troubled with each detail. "It's happening to others," Vogel said. "The same dream, the same cathedral, the same figure. Men who have seen the towers move, who have heard the bells toll. They're being called." "Called to what?" "To join the eternal choir," Vogel said, repeating the words from the dream, "to sing the song that will end the war." Matthias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Vogel admitted, "but I think we're about to find out." They made their way to the command bunker, where Lieutenant Brennan was waiting with a report in his hands. His face was pale, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much. "3 more sectors have reported tower movement," he said without preamble, "and in each case, the men who witnessed it have begun to disappear." "Disappear, sir?" "They walk out into no man's land during the fog," Brennan said. "They walk toward the towers, and they don't come back. The sentries don't see them go. The wire doesn't slow them down, and the enemy doesn't fire on them. They just walk, and they vanish." Matthias felt his mouth go dry. "How many?" 17 men in the last 3 days, Brennan said. "All of them experienced soldiers. All of them men who had been in the trenches for months. All of them men who had seen the towers move." Vogel leaned forward. "What does Command want us to do?" "Command wants us to hold our positions," Brennan said. "They don't believe the reports about the towers. They think it's mass hysteria, shell, shock, a breakdown in discipline. They've ordered court-martial proceedings for any man who abandons his post." "And what do you think, sir?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I think we're fighting something that we don't understand. Something that has learned to use our own faith against us, and I think we're losing." The vibration began again, so low it was felt rather than heard. The walls of the bunker began to shake, and dust fell from the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, a sound began to build, the sound of massive weights shifting, of stone grinding against stone, of metal scraping against metal. "The fog is rolling in," Vogel said, his voice tight with tension. Brennan nodded grimly. "All units to stand, 2, full alert, and if any man tries to leave his position, shoot him. It's a mercy." They made their way back to the firing positions, where the other soldiers were already at their posts. The fog was indeed rolling in, thick and dark, carrying with it the scent of incense and blessed rust. But there was something else in the air now, something that made Matthias's skin crawl and his teeth ache. It was the smell of bronze heated to near melting, of metal under enormous stress, of sound made manifest, and underneath it all, barely perceptible, was the scent of roses. The roses that grew in the churchyards of home, the roses that had been blessed by the priests and watered with the tears of the faithful. The towers were calling their children home. Matthias took his position at the periscope, scanning the fog-shrouded wasteland beyond. The towers were still there, 17 of them in their sector, standing motionless in the exact positions they had always occupied. But their shadows were moving now, stretching and contracting like living things, reaching toward the trench with grasping fingers. The first bell began to toll. The sound came from the tower closest to their position, the one that leaned at its impossible angle. It was a deep, resonant note that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself, shaking loose stones from the trench walls and causing the blessed water at their feet to ripple in perfect circles. But this time, Matthias was ready. He had spent the day preparing, consulting with the chaplain, studying the war psalms, searching for some way to resist the call of the towers. He had found references to the bells in the ancient texts, warnings about the dangers of sound weaponized against the faithful. The towers were not just structures, they were conduits, channels through which the Hell Gate of Jerusalem exerted its influence. They had been built by the faithful, blessed by the priests, consecrated with the blood of martyrs. But 8 centuries of war had corrupted them, turned them into something else entirely. They had become traps, snares, designed to catch the souls of the faithful and bind them to the eternal war. The bell tolled again, and this time Matthias felt the pull more strongly. It was not just sound, but something deeper, something that spoke to the part of him that yearned for peace, for rest, for an end to the endless conflict. The tower was offering him what he had always wanted, a way home. He fought against the compulsion, reciting the war psalms under his breath, focusing on the feel of his rifle in his hands, the weight of his equipment, the solid reality of the trench around him. But the bell was persistent, its note growing stronger, more insistent, and he could feel his resistance weakening. Through the periscope, he watched the tower lift itself from the earth, its metal legs unfolding like the limbs of some enormous spider. It took a step toward their position, and the ground shook with its footfall. The bell within its chamber swung without a clapper, its bronze throat open like a mouth, and the light within grew brighter. Other towers were moving now, their forms ghostly and indistinct in the fog. They moved in a rough line, their bells tolling in harmony, creating a wall of sound that pushed against the defenders like a physical force. Men began to fall to their knees, their hands pressed to their ears, blood streaming from their noses and mouths. But some did not fall. Some stood, their faces vacant, their eyes fixed on the advancing towers. They began to walk, climbing out of the trench with slow, measured steps, their weapons left behind in the mud. They walked toward the towers, and the bells welcomed them with gentle chimes. Matthias saw Private Weber among them, a young man from Bavaria who had been in the trenches for 6 months. His face was peaceful, serene, as if he had finally found what he had been searching for. He walked through the wire without being cut, across the crater-pocked earth without stumbling, toward the tower that called to him. The tower's bell chamber opened wider, and the light within grew brighter. Weber stepped inside, and the light enveloped him. For a moment, Matthias could see him clearly, standing in the bronze throat of the bell, his face radiant with joy. Then the light faded, and Weber was gone. But the bell continued to toll, and now it carried a new note, a harmony that had not been there before. Weber's voice had been added to the choir, his soul bound to the eternal song that would end the war. More men were walking now, climbing out of the trenches throughout the sector. They moved with the same slow, measured steps, their faces peaceful, their eyes fixed on the towers. The bells welcomed them all, their notes growing richer, more complex, as each new voice was added to the choir. Matthias felt the pull growing stronger, and he knew he was losing the battle. The tower closest to his position was only yards away now, its bell chamber open, its light warm and welcoming. He could hear voices calling to him from within, voices that he recognized. His father's voice, his mother's voice, the voices of friends who had died in the war. They were calling him home. He took a step toward the tower, then another. The rifle fell from his hands, forgotten in the mud. The war fell away, the trenches and the fog and the other soldiers fading like smoke. Only the tower remained, its bronze throat open, its light pulsing with the rhythm of his heart. But then something grabbed his arm. It was Vogel, his face contorted with effort, his voice barely audible over the tolling of the bells. "Fight it," he was shouting. "Remember who you are. Remember what you're fighting for." Matthias blinked, and the world snapped back into focus. He was standing in the trench, his rifle at his feet, the tower looming above him. The bell was tolling, its note pure and terrible, and he could feel the pull of the light within its chamber. But he remembered now. He remembered the dream, the cathedral, the figure behind the altar. He remembered the warnings in the war psalms, the dangers of sound weaponized against the faithful. He remembered that the towers were not offering peace but slavery, not rest but eternal servitude. He picked up his rifle and raised it, not at the tower's stone body, but at the bell within its chamber. The bullet struck the bronze throat, and for a moment, the tolling stopped. The tower wavered, its massive form becoming translucent, and Matthias thought he had succeeded. But then the bell began to toll again, louder than before, and the tower solidified once more. The bullet had passed through the bronze throat without effect, and the structure continued its advance. Its shadow fell across their position like a shroud, and the light within its bell chamber grew brighter. Matthias fired again and again, working the bolt with desperate speed. Each bullet struck true, but none had any effect. The tower was invulnerable to conventional weapons, protected by faith and curse in equal measure. But then he remembered something the chaplain had told him, a verse from the war psalms that spoke of the power of silence, of the strength that came from refusing to listen to the voices of the damned. He dropped his rifle and pressed his hands to his ears, not to block out the sound but to focus on the silence beneath it. The bell tolled louder, its note becoming harsh and discordant. The tower leaned forward, its bell chamber opening wider, and the light within grew brighter. But Matthias held onto the silence, the peace that existed in the spaces between the notes. And slowly, gradually, the tower began to fade. Its form became translucent, then ghostly, then invisible. The bell's tolling grew weaker, more distant, until it was nothing more than a whisper in the wind. The light within its chamber flickered and died, and the tower was gone. But the other towers remained, their forms solid and real, their bells tolling in harmony. They had taken their tribute, claimed their voices, and now they were returning to their positions in no man's land. The fog began to clear, and the sounds of the war returned, machine guns chattering and artillery rumbling in the distance. Matthias looked around the trench, counting the men who remained. Half of his unit was gone, walked out into the fog and consumed by the towers. Their weapons lay abandoned in the mud, their positions empty, their voices added to the eternal choir. Vogel was beside him, his face pale with exhaustion. "How many?" he asked. "Too many," Matthias replied. "And tomorrow night they'll come again." The sergeant nodded grimly. "The chaplain says the towers are growing stronger. Each voice they claim makes them more powerful, more real. Soon they won't need the fog to move. They'll walk in broad daylight, and all the faithful will hear their call." Matthias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "And when that happens?" "When that happens," Vogel said, "the war will end, not with victory or defeat, but with silence. The eternal silence of the choir." They stood in the trench, watching the towers in the distance. They were motionless now, their bell chambers dark and empty, their foundations firmly planted in the earth. But Matthias knew they were waiting, patient as stone, certain as death. They had time, endless time, and they would claim every faithful soul before the war was done. The fog rolled in again, and the towers began to toll. Their notes were richer now, more complex, harmonized by the voices of the faithful they had claimed. The sound was beautiful, peaceful, and Matthias felt his fears and doubts melting away. Somewhere in the distance, another soldier was climbing out of his trench, walking toward the light. The towers called to him with gentle chimes, welcoming him home. And in the bronze throats of the bells, other voices joined the eternal song, singing the melody that would end the war. Matthias pressed his hands to his ears, holding on to the silence, the peace that existed in the spaces between the notes. But the song was growing stronger, more insistent, and he could feel his resistance weakening. The towers were patient, certain, and they would wait as long as it took. The war would end, not with victory or defeat, but with silence. The eternal silence of the choir that sang in the bells of the towers that walked on sound. And in the fog-shrouded wasteland of no man's land, 17 towers stood motionless, their shadows reaching toward the trenches like grasping fingers. They were waiting, patient as stone, certain as death, and when the fog rolled in thick enough, when the faithful had been tested beyond their breaking point, they would walk again. The bells would toll, and the faithful would answer. One by one, they would walk out into the fog, toward the light that promised peace, but delivered only servitude. Their voices would join the eternal choir, singing the song that would end the war and begin something far worse. Matthias stood in the trench, his rifle forgotten in the mud, his hands pressed to his ears. The silence was growing thinner, more fragile, and he could hear the first notes of the song beginning to penetrate his defenses. The towers were calling, and he was running out of reasons not to answer. In the distance, the fog thickened, and the shadows began to move. The towers were walking again, their metal legs carrying them across the wasteland toward the trenches. Their bells tolled in harmony, and the faithful began to rise from their positions, their faces peaceful, their eyes fixed on the light. The war continued, as it always had, as it always would. But now it had a voice, a song that would never end. And in the bronze throats of the bells, the choir sang on, eternal and damning, calling the faithful home to a peace that was no peace at all. The towers walked on sound, and the sound was the voice of the faithful, singing their own requiem in the endless war that had already claimed their souls.